Greetings. This is the online anthropology teaching segment on Gabusi sexuality with a special emphasis on male sexuality concerning 3 decades of change among the Gabusi and the question of continuity as well as change in the bargain. We are still here in the heart of the rainforest, the general location of the Gabusi over their period of concern. Starting in the 1980s. Here's Dolii with the yellow costuming of the in-between initiation stage. You can see his tobacco pipe that he's going to be giving to visitors, and he's actually holding 2 leaf rolls of tobacco, one in his hand and one in the pipe. You see the long phallic leaf strapped to his groin area, and he's a symbolization here of kind of effervescent sexuality, which has been kind of his growth and development and maturation has had fruition with that, and the phallic nature of this expression is symbolized in the long bamboo pipe and the nose plug that he wears, as well as his phallic leaf. Now here's Howie in the yellow costuming, who was a sexual lover or liaison partner with Dolii during large parts of the initiation build-up to the final celebrations. Here are the initiates in their yellow costuming giving plates of food. Interestingly, this was the initiation equivalent of some of the food giving seen in the Livelihoods online segment earlier in the course. So Dolii and Howie here in the foreground were quite a tandem, although that was only part of their larger orientation, as we shall see. Now, among the older men, as the man on the left, who's one of the initiate sponsors and one of the initiates, there were sometimes situations of sexual congress where the younger man would receive semen from the older man, particularly through fellatio, as a way of increasing his growth and sustenance. This was done relatively privately and secretly, and these relationships were opportunistic and not easy to categorize. So there was some transmission of semen and sexual life congress between older men and the initiates and the younger teenagers, as well as between the initiates in age cohort relations as well. Now here's Murrah, the young man Murrah, who kind of came on to me during my first field work during a spirit seance, as described, I believe, in chapter 5 of the Gabusi book. He was a very a fun young man, although I, as described, didn't have relationships with him. But this is indicative of the kind of free expression of sexual orientation that was quite acceptable among Gabusi men at that time. And here's Howie in a somewhat more jaunty pose than in his yellow initiation costume viewed earlier. And in the early days, he was quite a dapper fellow. Now here's Howie and a more serious guys on the left during the initiation painting with Swamin, the very important spirit medium who's his main initiate sponsor on the right, painting him. So the idea was that, as described previously, the costuming and the final initiation emblazoned and embodied the red bird of paradise in meticulous fashion on the body of the dancer. Here's the final complete costume with UI as the focal point of attention here. The various costume elements given from various relatives. But the point for this context is that the stunning young man as initiate is an embodiment and an incarnation of a red bird of paradise, which is the primarily young female reincarnate form identified in spirit seances as being particularly beautiful, particularly sexy, particularly available for sexual congress with men. So as the embodiment of this woman on a man's body, there's a kind of a bisexual or a multidimensional aspect of attraction, and everyone, men and women, find the costume initiates as particularly alluring and beautiful and attractive in a number of different ways. Here the initiates all lined up together, and collectively, of course, they symbolize the effervescent sexual maturation of the society as a whole, and then when lined up with the women in the final climactic ceremony among men and women with their collective sexuality among the younger people as a whole as well. Now, the role of women in this process is not at all incidental, and at the same time that men may be having sexual activities with each other at this life stage, they're also highly interested in women and describe their own sexual orientation, or sexual, I should say, attraction to each other as only being a displacement of their real desire, which is for women. The idea being that I would like to have a woman, but if I can't, and it's impossible to have one, then I'm so pent up that I will reach for you, my male counterpart next to me, instead of her. So women like this were very desired and very talked about and pined about, and women, of course, were the center of men's sexual fantasies as expressed very dramatically in the all-night male spirit seances during this period of time as well. Now, Gabusi women in normal daily garb went around bare-breasted, and this was both common, but it did not go unremarked by men in terms of women's physical development and their attractiveness. And the attraction between men and women was symbolized at the climactic final initiation ceremonies with the dancing of the full costume dancer across from a female initiate in a very charged symbolic display of sexual relationship and congress and union between them, with the female, the woman on the left, shaking that rattle toward her groin area at the man as the man is pounding his long drum. And then you can see in the background the attraction between the man on the right, who's smiling with blue shorts, for the woman who's draped her arm over the costume woman over the sago-thatched wall there. And so you have flirting in the background that parallels the symbolic courtship and union, very sexually charged as a symbol in the foreground. Now, women very much enjoyed these activities as well, and became part of the dynamic in important ways. This is a young woman who's very happily in her own costuming and not ashamed of her, sexual maturation, at least as seeming by her disposition and generally among the Gabusi at this time. And this is an older woman who was the target of Dolii, and at the same time that he was having relationships with Howie as his male partner, he also snuck into and was found out to be in sexual congress with this woman, this older woman, and it was quite an embarrassment and a scandal in the community, and she was beaten afterwards, and Dolii himself was almost prevented from undergoing the initiation himself as a result of his transgression. So the kind of bisexual orientation of men at this point, particularly those such as Dolii, was highly evident. Now, some of the other, one of the prospective initiates forewent initiation altogether because of his attraction to women. This is Sagawa on the left. Here he's serving kava for a community feast. But Sagawa ended up becoming attracted to and having a sexual affair with Sialim after Dugowe committed suicide. And his relationship with her was also scandalous and did cause him to be prevented from undergoing the initiation. And here is Sagawa in Red Bird of Paradise costume, and Solwoi joking to the left with an axe that he's going to split his skull because he's so enamored of Sagawa's beauty and attractiveness with the big Red Bird of Paradise costume that he can't take it anymore, and he's going to do him in as a joke. And you can see his kind of smirking smile a little bit behind that. So this is a display of antagonistic joking over sexual arousal, not in the sense of sexual attraction, but in terms of eliminating the source of the frustration, in this case being Sagawa with the Red Bird of Paradise headdress. Now, after the initiation, the initiates did in fact get married to women and started fathering children. And here's Ui on the left with his new wife Warbui on the right. And this is a period of very significant association and romantic congress in a way that we might recognize in a Western courtship contexts. Now we'll shift to the 1990s, having gone through some of the sexual orientations and parameters in the 1980s. And by this time, of course, things had changed. Here's Howie. From before, now a pilot cargo agent for the Mission Aviation Fellowship Air office at Nomad Station with his calculator and keeping track of the manifest with the kilos and the various weights and accounting of the plane. And Howie, also here on the left, is now a translator in the Evangelical Church of Papua New Guinea, translating for the pastor on the right. And he's fathered several children and is married and so on. And his previous identity is no longer in explicit evidence. And here is Dolii, who was Howie's partner in earlier days. He's gone on and married and had several children. He also was distinctive in having, when his first wife died, taken the initiative to attack and kill and actually behead the sorcerer who was deemed responsible for his first wife's illness and death. And he went to prison for 5 years in the capital as a result, and came back was repatriated to Nomad and became a stalwart citizen and even a very strong lay leader in the Catholic Church. So his life also changed, of which his previous behaviors as a young initiate were something of the past. Now, for the current generation at this point, here's a photo of Wabebiai, who was the son of Swamin, the spirit medium. And here he is as an adult man himself. His father's passed away, this being in 1998, smoking a traditional tobacco pipe. And Wabebiai at this point was one of the most traditionally oriented Gabusi men in the settlement. Here I am with, Wabebiai on the right, and two other men, before a feast at a distant settlement, at which Wabebiai himself would get dressed up and dance in traditional costume. And here he is on the right, along with Kamu on the left, just before that feast, and meticulously costumed and very dignified and with a sense of great pride and demeanor, with the full indigenous costuming very important to him at this stage, and he was very oriented toward traditional activities like hunting in the forest, and this was somewhat problematic because society and social change were moving in a different direction at this time. Now, as an illustration of the changes, here at the Nomad Independence Day ceremonies in 1998, a local man playing a white patrol officer from the past on the left is berating and describing how ignorant and silly and stupid the quote primitive villager painted on the left is, and many of the skits made fun of old-time traditional costumes and practices on the basis of modern ways that were considered to be much more developed and important. So this was some of the larger general context as the Gabusi Corners oriented more toward the Nomad Station and its activities at this time. Now, women also were becoming more, quote, modern in different ways. Here are two women at a feast, including Magi, who we'll hear about later, as well as Moose, dressed up in finery in an important way. So a very significant shift in female costuming and what was important to them in terms of their courtship and relationships with men. And here are men dressed up in kind of neo-traditional costume with guitars, electric guitars powered by a motorcycle battery for Independence Day celebrations. So the ideal of male status and allure as a young bachelor has significantly changed from the past. And another possibility would be to take a role as a man in church. The man on the left here is playing the role of Angel Gabriel in a pageant at the Independence Day ceremonies, and that was another role of significance for a number of men, leaders in the church. Now, in terms of showing your kind of stuff as a young buck, dancing disco was also very significant. These two men, one of whom is in kind of a farcical or neo-traditional costume on the right and the other in more modern dress in the west, are both dancing disco at a disco competition. at the Nomad Station in 1998. And these were all things that Wobebiai felt very uncomfortable with and really had no inkling to try to compete with or be part of that social context in a more, quote, modern masculine guise. As opposed to that, the idea of having a cool shirt, beads, shades, and a modern style haircut and so on were definitely the rage at that time. Now, women were attracted to these kind of masculine dynamics, and both of these women in the failed sister exchange described in chapter 10 of the Gabusi book were Magi and Kabum, were attracted to men who were more dandies in the sense. Magi's marriage on the left did not work out, and she was severely chastised. She was exerting greater marital choice, but also wrestling with the implications of trying to reject that choice. And then on the rebound, as described toward the end of chapter 10, she did in fact marry Wobebiai. So the two of them ended up being married, and since then have had several children and are together as a couple as of 2013 and probably to the present. Now, at the same time of these changes, there were dimensions of kind of men identifying with women and women's roles in ways that were still evident, including publicly. Here in 1998, at the disco ceremony competition, was a man in the foreground dressed as a woman, as a number of men did. And this was considered completely acceptable as part of the range of costuming that would be permissible at these events, and everybody would gather and laugh and consider it to be a fun kind of occasion. In addition, a more dramatic indication of male transvestism or cross-dressing was evident at some of the rituals. This is a picture of a man who's dressed up very self-consciously, in a sense, with a woman's bra. Of course, as a man, he doesn't need to wear that, and it's clearly a sign that he's impersonating or dressing, in fact, as a woman, since women at this point would, in fact, wear bras when they would be dressing in costume and not be going bare-breasted. And then the following Sunday, I saw the same man on the left here as an assistant pastor at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was one of the most fundamentalist denominations strong at Nomad at that time, with very strong rules and regulations about all sorts of things, including playing football or soccer and dancing and other things. So his behavior here shows an ability to cross, not just cross-dress, but cross-switch between different modalities of modern and traditional and of gender and religious identity as well. Now, the model of a family with Keda here on the left and his son Makus in the middle and his wife Bene on the right was something that was becoming more evident among the Gabusi at this time, but still in relationship to many other activities. But it's also a reminder that men really had, in large part, given up not just their behavior of sexual identification with each other, but also their sense of identification with that. It's very important that Wobebiai, when he came to me, as described in chapter 10, was not at all interested or aghast at the idea of having sex with another man, or the idea that Gabusi customs in the past had emphasized or allowed that, but rather he was interested in finding ways to attract a woman. So by the late 1990s, the younger generation of Gabusi men really had no sense of identification with, or in some cases even understanding or perhaps even awareness of the activities of sexual attraction between men that were expressed in an earlier generation. And among those who were present with Wobebiai and my conversations with him, and the sense of being aghast and, if not ashamed or in a kind of amazement that these practices of sex between men occurred in the past, was Sayu and Didika. And Sayu we'll see again further on in this presentation, and in a different kind of modality as well. Okay, now we'll move to 2013, and at this point I will introduce some of the video clip material that will follow after this narrated PowerPoint presentation. And the question of further change or continuity is a very important one, and rather than coming to any absolute conclusions, I'll suggest some things and give some evidence and let you watch the video clips and follow in consideration for future deliberation in terms of the quiz questions that follow this presentation. Now, the Gabusi 2000 video clips associated with sexuality include the following. The first clip is of men's verbal sex joking at night, a little short of 3 minutes. And the joking, I'm not able to translate while the track is running, so I'll just describe, is very quick, witty and metaphoric comments about being so sexually pent up, wanting women, being pining for sex, and if women aren't available, then serving kava or semen to other men who might drink it or might joke that they might drink it if they were pent up enough themselves, but stated in very funny, euphemistic, and elusive nature. And the verbal dialogue of this joking is very similar to that which I heard in the 1980s, during which sexual relations between men were much more developed, although not between adult men themselves. And it's worth emphasizing that both in the earlier period and in this video clip, the men who are speaking are largely in their 30s, late 20s, 30s, and 40s, and are married men with children who are the primary jokesters, and not likely to be candidates actually of any actual sexual congress with each other, or except in unusual cases with younger boys in the 1980s, and no evidence of any male-male sexual activity among them or with other Gabusi in 2013, or for that matter in 2008. Now, the second video, several short ones, have to do with dancing, dancing of adult men with young women and girls on the outskirts. So the dancing really is between the adult men themselves. And they're very boisterous and disco dancing, laughing and joking, in some cases how horny and, quote, sad they are, sad because they're alone and need company, physical company from other people. On one or two occasions, they actually broke down with grief and sadness during the disco and started crying, and then popped back into their more boisterous selves, which is a very interesting emotional oscillation among a very few of them. But the dancing was really only between the men themselves, the adult men, and you can see in the last clip, a little bit toward the end, the women and children are on the outskirts of the event, the younger children dancing a little bit among themselves and some of the women, but not in interaction with the men themselves. So there are three clips totaling a bit over 2 minutes in total regarding disco dancing in 2013. And then finally, a video clip of two clips of men's physical sexual joking in 2013 between Sayu and Subayai. And in this case, the first video clips provide the social context. The camera just kind of pans around so you can see all the people that are in the general context, including some women on the outskirts and a bunch of children around. So it's very public. There's a lot of people around. This is underneath one of the houses. And then the second the clip shows the physical joking itself between Sayu and Subayai. And in this case, Soyo at one point even says to me as I'm filming that he's going to pry apart Subayai's legs and expose them. So there's horseplay of kind of what we might call crotch grabbing, which is a general spectacle rather obviously than an actual sexual congress or sense of that. Okay, so that's a bit of a description of the video clips. And just as a reminder, here is a photo of Sayo in 2013, within a few days actually of when the video clip was taken. And here he is with some of his 7 children, including 5 by his wife Dangsop. in his parents-in-law's house. And he's obviously quite the family man, as well as someone who still likes to dance and joke around as well. He's still, in a sense, an adult dandy in a different genre. So this raises a lot of interesting questions and issues with respect to both Sayou and Wobebiai's reaction to the revelation by me of Gabusi men's sexual relationships with other men in the 1990s, and now kind of the more updated relationship between various aspects of sexual orientation and identity. Okay, at this point, and in closing here, a few comments. I'd like to distinguish importantly between sexual identity, sexual orientation, and sexual behavior, or sex, what we might call sex itself, actually having sex. Sexual identity would be what you would proclaim or you would say about yourself. In other words, in a Western context, I am straight or I am gay, for instance. Sexual orientation you might take as the general proclivities of someone, what they orient toward, what they tend to move toward or be in relationship to as an object of sexual desire and orientation or attempt to cultivate relationship with. And then finally is actual sexual behavior. In other words, the act of sex, which can be at variance. In other words, you could have a sexual identity and orientation, but actually not have, you could be chaste, either a gay virgin or a straight virgin, for instance. Or you could have all three of these, identity, orientation, and behavior, be lined up. Or you could have behavior which is quite discrepant from the identity which you claim, or the orientation that you seem to have predilection for. So these behavior, identity, and orientation are three different aspects of sexuality, which can be useful as we tease apart some of the aspects and the complexities of Gabusi sexuality over time, and also the significance it has for our own understanding of sexuality cross-culturally and in Western societies as well. So, for instance, might think in a context of gay as being an identity that might be proclaimed, or and in the context of the Melanesian context, I mentioned before in presentation about ritualized homosexuality, which was designated as a anthropological term for some of the societies in southern New Guinea, such as the Gabusi, and the problems associated with attributing that term, which is not a native term, to the identities or orientations or behaviors of people like the Gabusi themselves. And the third term here is useful, which is simply male-male sexuality. In other words, that is simply the act of having sex with another male. Apart from whether you consider it to be your identity or whether you tend to be oriented that way, just the physical or the physiological congress, as it were, in sexual terms. Now, the Gabusi by certainly 2008 and 2013, and even by 1998, had a lack of ritualization concerning sex-related orientations. So the term ritualized homosexuality now is somewhat meaningless, or at least not very significant, insofar as the ritualization of sexuality between men, which was indicated in senior and junior relations, but also among the initiates themselves, and the costuming and the sense of life force transmission as connection with spiritual belief has dissipated and very much changed. So that is certainly the case. And one might also ask, even if the term homosexuality applied to Gabusi at an earlier period is correct, insofar as they didn't have a sexual identity as being exclusively homosexuality, they didn't call themselves that, and you could even question whether the sexual orientation, even among the early relationship between Dolai and Howie, whether that was, bisexual, since Dolai also had relationships with women, at about the same period. So this throws into question some of the terms that we would attribute to the Gabusi. And then here, Gabusi actual practice of men having sex with other men is now rare and or not normative and or not or individual and or not known. That is, it's not talked about. When you ask about it, they say we don't do this, we don't do it anymore. It doesn't mean that it's technically possible that some individuals, as in any society, might have sexual behavior that they either might not make public, or that even if you asked about, they might not tell you about. If you were making a detailed study of sexuality, you could get into those with private interviews more. But as far as I know, MSM, or men having sex with other men, is no longer the case among Gabusi, or if it is, it's probably rare. But it's not a normative practice. It's not seen as something that's part of their as known as aspects of their sexual behavior, much less as their sexual orientation or sexual identity. And then finally here, an important distinction between what we might call homosocial activity and behavior versus homosexual activity and behavior. That is, you could have sexual orientation and joking or male bonding in various ways that has a social dimension, for instance with Sayo, with Subayai, or with older men in previous days as well as now joking, as opposed to actually being an expression of sexual behavior. It doesn't mean that it might not be an expression of sexual behavior, as in the 1980s there was certainly sexual congress between men in various ways, probably less so between elder and younger men in any known way easily than between the initiates themselves. But that distinction, I think, is important and perhaps a helpful one to make sense of some of the changes that we've seen in Gabusi society over time. Now, in terms of categorizing and classifying sexual orientation, again, sex practices versus sex orientation versus self-proclaimed sexual identity these are important distinctions to make. And one thinks of Western, if one were to apply this to Western sexual identity categories such as straight, bi, gay, etc., it may seem relatively unproblematic, although you certainly can have behavior that might have a sexual dimension that wouldn't fall into these categories. Certainly, if you consider the heteronormative or straight subtypes, there are various attributes that people have to either designate for others or self-proclaim senses of their own sexual identity, whether they're a stud or that person's a slut or a friend with benefits or this person's frigid, this person's already taken. So there are various designations that we would use within the heteronormative category that would classify and categorize people, perhaps ourselves, in many cases others. And these also may or may not have a relationship which is adequate or accurate between behavior on the one hand, their overall orientation, much less what they would claim or want to have claimed as an identity with respect to them. So what we see as the kind of discrepancies and complicated relationships over time among Gabusi are ones that are not completely immune or beyond understanding in our own cultural context. I mean, on Emory campus, the tension between what happens at fraternities and sororities on weekends, what is consensual sex, what is not consensual sex, what sexual orientations are being expressed, what kind of subtypes in this terminology are being cultivated, embraced, rejected, or projected on unwanted terms are important things that have a variable relationship. And that's important as a phenomenon over time. Now, Michel Foucault, who's a very famous French historian and theorist of institutions, modern institutions, including ones in relationship to sexuality, penned a chapter called We Other Victorians, which is relevant here. And that is, he tried to refine our notion of sexuality in important ways. In particular, he asked, in our modern age, we claim or represent often that sexual orientation, sexual proclivities are unrepressed, that we have an ability to express ourselves sexually in very open ways, particularly at young life stages before marriage and during times like college years, for instance. And he questions, is this really an unbridled license, or is it imposing a different kind of unspoken necessity or social constraint or even requirement that we adopt a predefined sexual identity? In other words, that sexuality is important inadvertently elevated in our pantheon to be the primary or one of the primary symbols or significances of who we are, and then slotted into some sort of predefined mold that may in itself be very constraining. So in effect, he asks, is the liberation of sexuality itself its own constraint of different types of sexuality, of concern about whether we're sexual enough or too sexual or appropriately sexual, and designating others or self-designating ourselves? These categories and boxes are ones that he questioned as whether they had the same degree of freedom that they were represented to be within Western culture. Now, this brings us to the final point, which concerns the social and cultural construction of sexuality. And just push a little further on some of the issues that were already raised earlier in the course. And that is, first of all, that the social and cultural construction of sexuality does not suggest that certain sexual morals and sexual ethics should be either important or unimportant. In other words, it's not a stance on whether a given form of sexuality or lack of sexuality is good or bad or sideways. It's not concerned with that issue. It does illuminate the variable relationship between acts, orientations, and identities. In other words, when we start to consider what the cultural and the social construction of acceptable or self-proclaimed identities and orientations, we then can look and see what the relationship is between those and reflect on that in a more nuanced and sensitive and understanding way. And then I'll conclude with what my own kind of editorial statement, in a sense, which is, in my own opinion, that an awareness, a nuanced awareness of the social and cultural construction of sexuality in other cultures, and also in our own, can be liberating, not for and against a certain kind of way of being sexual, but for understanding and for self-understanding sex in a more helpful and satisfying way that both understands and respects one's own orientation, identity, and behavior, as well as that of others. So this is not a moral or ethical statement about a certain kind of sexuality, whether it's good or bad, to be straight, promiscuous, restrictive, chaste, either as a woman or as a man, but rather to note that the projection of types and then of personal whole identities around sexuality is a social and constructed process that's worth being critically aware of, including for ourselves, rather than being an automatic or pre-given process. And personally, I think this can be liberating, not just for pursuing or for avoiding or denigrating one or another sexual act, but coming to terms with the person in a more personal and collective way about sexual identity in ways that are considered sensitive and responsible.
Okay. Well, what do you mean? What you want to get on? I say, Nigga. What you want to get? What you hope to do? What you want to get? What you hope to do? What we got? I'm a hope to do. I'm a hope. Yeah, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. Carlos, am I doing it? Getting away again. How much are we going? No, who do we know? I would have me. Why is it? What kind of way are you? How we did it? What am I? How do you do it? It's not because you want to. Beaga, near one eye to my walk, near one. Beaga near down my family. What in your we have the father? Ima, of your will be able to my manova. Vida, I ain't going to be up some gas idea. Fucking, I want them. I want to go. Funny to get that up now. It's not my funny. Of which man will I have? I'm a quiet. The family, what telephone is up the wall? You must have a very bad. Nigga, all I want my everybody behind you. I've got now making that. Who does not have got a fucking about? he was your garment about what you have put away your job to the guy who was somebody come. Why you white as also get you Saha while you were. Why was I'm some behind you go by a gun. We are in a week for young Columbian bath that my bath I'm on the outside. Sorry, I'm not going to do one month. I've won the I had a fee and a money again. Baby, what are about more money? Why do you have a son? You have them. What do you have to come up after which guy? What was Munigan? Only a partner. The monkey was moving boy in my hand. We are we going to about fish again? Africa, Fago, I will I was see question to our arm. No, it over. What mother was saying? I'm not good amigo. Where are they? No, I do him. Let's side. Time to so high. Need to go some. Oh, so go. Okay. Okay, keep go kata so. Go kaya ba imda. Aba imda. Dego buka. Oi, pwede ka hasin ko. Tuma yi hosu hida wa bu amaya. Ele me aí afka de ui do gobinha. Kai mam aí afka de ui do. Some guy. Ah, we teach him a wow. Oh, sale.
Abu dua, ekor dua. Kalau berani tu, berani. Berani terpakai. Abu berani. Berani dua. Ya kamu terpakai. Aku ini budak kan.
Berani jangan dua dah, berani. Jika berani,
วันนี้ว่าสิ่งที่เด็กได้ก็เขาทำเก่าได้
hút nó đưa bay hút bay.
Em cứ nhìn nó. Ê, đâm lâm đi xem vào. Nó yêu con nó cái gì à?
Đây. Mất rồi. Đây đam.
Okay, mua cái gì nữa?
Chứ để tua đó vậy hoa hoa. Mesele program. Ya ma gra.
Kia phụ ba mà cái sao kia mới đã.
Cái gì vậy kìa em mesele. Có cái sao?
Kia hết lúc cái ta.
Cái đó tới đây kìa.